The reasons for atheism, or as I would prefer to say anti-theism, are, I would say, as follows. The first and the simplest objection to religious belief is that its metaphysical claims are not true, in fact are false, and come from a period that I would describe as the infancy or the fearful childhood of our species, when, because we have brains that seek for information and seek for explanation, brains that even now prefer a conspiracy theory to no theory at all, and are bound to do so, and indeed in some ways a right to seek in this way, explanations had to be found for things that seemed at the time inexplicable. And in the absence of crucial information, we didn't know, we had no way to know that the Earth went around the sun. Didn't know that there was a germ theory that would explain disease. Didn't have any means of knowing that earthquakes were the result of living on the crust of a cooling planet in a rather odd solar system where most of the planets are either too hot or too cold to support life, and our own is in large part too hot or too cold to support it either, and where the remainder lives on a climatic knife edge, and always has. Some design, by the way, and that's just of one solar system. We didn't know that matters of this kind, earthquakes, waves, disasters, were not punishments. It was quite possible to listen to those and even to believe those who thought that they could explain. But for these people, a double problem arises. There is first the difficulty of, if not the impossibility, of demonstrating the existence of any creator or designer at all. I think I say something uncontroversial when I say that no theologian has ever conclusively demonstrated that such a designer can or does or ever has existed. The most you can do, by way of the argument from design, is to infer him or her or it from an apparent harmony in the arrangements. And this was at a time when that was the very best that, so to speak, could be done. But religion goes a little further than this already rather impossible task and expects us to believe as follows: that the speaker not only can prove the existence of the said entity, but can claim to know this entity's mind. In fact, can claim to know it quite intimately, can claim to know his or her personal wishes, can in turn tell you what you may do in his name. A quite large arrogation of power, you will suddenly notice, is being granted to the speaker here. The speaker can tell you that he knows. He cannot tell you how, but he can tell you that he knows, for example, that heaven hates ham, that God doesn't want you to eat pork products. He can tell you that God has a very, very strong view about with whom you may have sexual relations, indeed, how you may have sexual relations with others. He can indicate, perhaps a little less convincingly, but no less firmly, that there are certain books or courses of study that you might want to avoid or treat with great suspicion. Now, this suggests to me already a design. I think I can see a design shaping up here, and I think I can see who designed it and created it. I think it was man-made. I think the whole inference, because you can certainly see a design at work, is that this is human, that it was designed at a time of great distress and great ignorance, and that it had an enormous advantage, the design of which can be inferred from every one of its practices. It gives to people, ministers, priests, rabbis, shamans, whoever's cell phone that is should know that we know where you live, by the way, and where your children go to school. It gives to those people power in the here and now, the only place where it really counts. If you are His Holiness the Pope and you have arrogated to yourself, for example, the power to bind and to loose, and to decide who may read what, and how many tithes must be paid, how many holy days must be observed, how many disciplines must be followed, are you seeking power in the hereafter, or are you seeking it now? It seems to me very obvious that, inescapable conclusion, that it's temporal power that's being talked about. And of a very dictatorial kind, I might add, an absolutist kind, a kind that is not open to the ordinary challenges. The divine right of kings was something you had to challenge not just at the risk of your life, which might end quickly, though the end itself would be slow and painful, the end would be final, but you were told you risked your immortal soul and the rest of your life too. That's quite a powerful instrument of secular discipline. And everyone can name their favorite example, I think, of how and where that kind of tyranny over the minds as well as the bodies of men was exerted. We think of it as belonging to our prehistory, but we only have to look as far as today's Iran, for example, to see a classic theocracy, a country from which I've recently returned, where I wondered how to convey sometimes the flavor of what theocracy really is like. Well, if you're a woman who gets in trouble with the regime and has committed a capital offense in Iran, but you're underage, you're a virgin, you may not be sentenced to death under the law of Iran, because the law forbids the execution of virgins. But you may be raped by the Revolutionary Guards so that you're no longer a virgin in the prison and then executed. I think that sort of conveys what people feel they're allowed to do when they think they have God on their side. And I could tell you far worse than that about what the arrogance of power is when it thinks it's backed by the divine. I have to be brief, so I'll be terse. Like a number of people who are students of religion, I've spent a lot of time lately, as you should if you have the opportunity, I recommend it very highly, with Professor Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity. Marvelous work of scholarship and literature, written by a mainstream believer, extraordinarily broad and deep, in which he ponders one very important question, the only one I've got time for now. What happened to the word Christendom? Remember, there used to be such a term. It used to extend across the world, and the hope is that it would extend even further. And it was unironically used to mean those areas of human civilization, and areas yet to be civilized, of course, where the word of Jesus Christ reigned or would reign. And it's all gone. The word is never used except historically or sarcastically now. And McCulloch doesn't say it ended because of the Crusades, though he could. It didn't. Crusades didn't kill it. Not because of slavery, mandated by Christianity. That didn't kill it either. Nor the mass murder of colonial subjects in the yet-to-be Christianized world. That wasn't sufficient. It didn't really end, he said, till 1914, when all the Christian empires of the world, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, France is a slight exception to this, but only a slight one, and Russia, all of them commanded by Christian emperors and calling upon their subjects as Christians, went to war with each other and very nearly destroyed the whole human civilization, and certainly reduced it to a point where we can't guess where we might be if it hadn't been for this extraordinary outbreak of barbarism. And out of that came the terrors of fascism and of Stalinism, of which it was the seedbed as well. I mention this partly because I want to maintain that there's no such thing as a religion of peace by definition. And second, to point out, and that its best historian has to admit something that if I was a Christian would make me humiliated. But because there was another empire involved in that war, the Ottoman Empire, which also came to an end, its other name was the Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate. It went to war on the side of German and Austrian imperialism and Hungarian imperialism, and it lost not just the war, having proclaimed a worldwide jihad against Christianity, except for German and Austrian and Hungarian Christianity, which were its allies. And it didn't just lose the war, but by 1924 had been dissolved by the Turkish leadership, by Ataturk. It lost the Caliphate. And that's the only one that still has supporters. The other Christian and religious empires have all gone. But the Caliphate still has fans, not just in the Muslim world, sometimes referred to by Muslims as the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, but also in what some Muslims call the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the part of the world that isn't yet Muslim. There are Caliphate clubs in London now and Berlin and elsewhere, quite important ones. And what I want to know is why that is and what we should think about it. Believers in this fantasy have, Laurie's spared me the need to say much of this, have committed extraordinary atrocities in Istanbul, in Madrid, in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and of course in our own fair city. And the pretexts for it vary. They can be
The excuse for the mass murder can be that Australia has helped East Timor become independent from Indonesia. They can be that Newsweek has printed a false story about the desecration of a supposedly holy book. You never know what it's going to be next. But everyone knows to be careful about it, and everyone understands that the threat of violence that backs it is believable. And that's my opening position. Now you will say, I can hear it already being said, you may be saying it already to yourselves because the defense mechanisms kick in. And in any case, Laurie already said it for you. And I hope Professor Ramadan won't feel the need to say it again, but if he does, fair enough. You may say, that's not the real Islam. Those aren't real Muslims. Now, isn't that a fascinating objection? Is there anyone in this room, I exempt Professor Ramadan because it's his turn to speak next, is there anyone in this room who would care to arbitrate that question? Who is to say, where is the authority that defines who is a true son of the Prophet or true interpreter of his work? Part of the problem to begin with, and it's part of the problem because it is a religion, is that it's perfectly true to say we don't know who the true Muslims are. How right that is, who does speak for it. Only the second problem with defining Islam as peaceful, only the second problem with defining it as peaceful has to do with the fact that it's highly fissile and highly schismatic, that there is a civil war going on within it, the religion of peace. As we speak, at least one civil war between the votaries of this religion of peace is already taking place, and some of it is exported outside that world into ours, very salient fact. The first reason, though, is this. Islam makes very large claims for itself, very large claims indeed. It claims to be the last and final religion, the last and final revelation. When you see bumper stickers, everyone says you can't reduce major things to a bumper sticker. It's not my idea to have bumper stickers saying Islam is the solution. It's a well-known slogan, actually, of parties associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They say Islam is the solution for everything. It takes care of all your life and the one to come. Sexuality, political economy, banking, diet, relations with other religions, everything. It's a total solution. What is creepy about the word total? I hope I don't have to tell an audience like this. It's the first 5 letters of the word totalitarian. It's absolute. It's absolute. It's all-inclusive. It's unanswerable. And oddly, for a religion that makes such large claims, notice another thing about Islam, it doesn't particularly like having these claims questioned or scrutinized. In other words, just as there is with all religions an inverse relationship between the claims they make and the evidence they can produce for them, you must have noticed that, with Islam, a younger religion, and perhaps therefore more in its first flush, there's an extraordinarily strong willingness to say that any challenge to its absolutist claims is by definition profane. And profanity and blasphemy can be the antecedent to very severe punishment, and often are, for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And this is not a road of peace in my submission. Thus my first point completed. The claim to govern everything from hygiene to sex and the afterlife, which contains detailed prescriptions for the good and bad versions of itself, again strikes me as somewhat totalitarian, and they're both based upon 2 very, very questionable and not very peaceful concepts. One is the idea of a perfect human being, the Prophet Muhammad, and the other is the idea of a perfect book, the Quran, the recitation. Now, the category perfect human primate or mammal and the category flawless book that could possibly not use any kind of change, revision, or editing are categories that do not exist. There are no members of these categories. Therefore, any challenge to this faith is bound to lead to heresy and to schism, and does. And just as all forms of absolutism and totalitarianism, leader worship and revealed truth, unalterable text, always do, because they can break, perhaps, but they cannot bend. and thus the latent potential of violence between them, among them, as well as within them, is very great. And at any moment, someone is in danger of being accused of being an apostate or an unbeliever. This week, the Coptic Pope of Egypt, Pope Shenouda, who represents 10 million Egyptians, was hustled onto Egyptian TV. He's not asked on all that often. I don't think he was even asked on this time. I think he was told he'd better come on. Why is the leader of Egypt's huge Christian minority suddenly compelled to make a TV appearance? Because one of his bishops had said in an interview that he thought that some of the verses of the Quran showed signs of having been added later on and to have been later accretion. And Pope Shenouda was forced onto the television to say, it's not that that didn't happen, it's it couldn't have happened. It shouldn't even be discussed. So that it has to be claimed even by non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim state that there is, after all, because no Christian claims this about the Bible anymore, no Jew claims it about the Pentateuch. After all, yes, there is just one book that's completely word and letter perfect from the first time it was not even written down, but recited. Now, demands that you believe the impossible do not lead to peaceful outcomes. Nor do they lead to peaceful or tolerant regimes. And I'm not going to ask you which Muslim country you would like to live in. I don't know whether Professor Ramana will tell us which one he would pick if he had to, because I don't have to ask you a question like that, because it's already in your mind.
Can you wind up now?
Yes, I can. I can, yes, and will. Shall, in fact. Sexual repression doesn't lead to peace. The idea that women are inferior to men is a profound cause of unease, let's say the least of it. All religions make some form of this claim. Islam seems to make it less apologetically than most. Claims that the world will come to an end in an apocalyptic form, which will lead to the victory of one religion or another, are not peaceful either. It's possible, perhaps, I haven't exhausted all my remarks, that the endless teaching of battle stories to children and the stories of lethal feuds from 7th century Arabia don't lead to peace, or the forcing of children to memorize and retell such stories by rote doesn't lead to peace either. It's arguable that peace isn't attainable at all. It may be arguable in some forms, and sometimes in places that religion isn't even desirable. But it will not come by the fanatical adoption of a man-made text and a man-made supreme leader. Nothing but war and tyranny has ever come from the adoption of formulae like these. The only way to moral and intellectual satisfaction, even temporary, perhaps only temporary, but of any kind at all, comes to those who are willing to take the great risk of thinking for themselves at all hazards and trying to share the benefits of that tolerance and that open-mindedness with others. And with that, for now, I'll rest my case. Thank you very much. Yes. Please.
If there is no God, why do you spend your whole life trying to convince people that there isn't?
Well, it isn't my whole career, for one thing. It's become a major preoccupation of my life, though, in the last 8 or 9 years, especially since September 11th, 2001, to try and help generate an opposition to theocracy and its depredations internationally. That is now probably my main political preoccupation, to help people in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Israel, resist those who sincerely want to encompass the destruction of civilization and sincerely believe they have God on their side in wanting to do so. Maybe I will take a few minutes just to say something that I find repulsive about especially monotheistic messianic religion. With a large part of itself, it quite clearly wants us all to die. It wants this world to come to an end. You can tell the yearning for things to be over whenever you read any of its real texts or listen to any of its real, authentic spokesmen, not the sort of the pathetic apologists who sometimes masquerade for it. Those who talk, there was a famous spokesman for this in Virginia until recently, about the rapture. Say that those of us who have chosen rightly will be gathered to the arms of Jesus, leaving all of the rest of you behind. If we're in a car, it's your lookout. That car won't have a driver anymore. If we're a pilot, that's your lookout. That plane will crash. We will be with Jesus, and the rest of you can go straight to hell. The eschatological element that is inseparable from Christianity. If you don't believe that there is to be an apocalypse, there is going to be an end, a separation of the sheep and the goats, a condemnation, a final one, then you're not really a believer. And the contempt for the things of this world shows through all of them. It's well put in an old rhyme from an English exclusive brethren sect. It says that we are the pure and chosen few, and all the rest are damned. There's room enough in hell for you. We don't want heaven crammed. You can tell it when you see the extreme Muslims talk. They cannot wait. They cannot wait for death and destruction to overtake and overwhelm the world. They can't wait for what I would call, without ambiguity, a final solution. When you look at the Israeli settlers, paid for often by American tax dollars, deciding that if they can steal enough land from other people and get all the Jews into the promised land and all the non-Jews out of it, then finally the Jewish people will be worthy of the return of the Messiah. And there are Christians in this country who consider it their job to help this happen so that Armageddon can occur, so that the painful business of living as humans and studying civilization and trying to acquire learning and knowledge and health and medicine and to push back can all be scrapped, and the cult of death can take over. That, to me, is a hideous thing in eschatological terms, in end times terms, on its own. A hateful idea, a hateful practice, and a hateful theory, but very much to be opposed in our daily lives, where there are people who sincerely mean it, who want to ruin the good relations that could exist between different peoples, nations, races, countries, tribes, ethnicities, who openly say they love death more than we love life, and who are betting that with God on their side, they're right about that. So when I say, as the subtitle of my book, that I think religion poisons everything, I'm not just doing what publishers like and coming up with a provocative subtitle. I mean to say it infects us in our most basic integrity. It says we can't be moral without Big Brother, without a totalitarian permission. It means we can't be good to one another. It means we can't think without this. We must be afraid. We must also be forced to love someone who we fear. The essence of sadomasochism. The essence of abjection. The essence of the master-slave relationship. And that knows that death is coming and can't wait to bring it on. I say this is evil. And though I do some nights stay home, I enjoy more the nights when I go out and fight against this ultimate wickedness and ultimate stupidity. Thank you.
Okay, let me see. I don't think it's going to take 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God. The atheist proposition is the following. Most of the time, it may not be said that there is no God. It may be said that there is no reason to think that there is one. That was the situation after Lucretius and Democritus and the original anti-theistic thinkers began their critique of religion. And I would just ask you all, ladies and gentlemen, to bear in mind a mild distinction while we go on. You may wish to be a deist, as my heroes Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were, and you may not wish to abandon the idea that there must be some sort of first or proximate cause or prime mover of the known and observable world and universe. But even if you can get yourself to that position, which we unbelievers maintain is always subject to better and more perfect and more elegant explanations, even if you can get yourself to that position, all your work is still ahead of you. to go from being a deist to a theist, in other words, from someone who says, God cares about you, knows who you are, minds what you do, answers your prayers, cares which bits of your penis or clitoris you saw away or have sawn away for you, minds who you go to bed with and in what way, minds what holy days you observe, minds what you eat, minds what positions you use for pleasure. All your work is still ahead of you, and lots of luck. Because there's nobody, even Aquinas had to give it up. There's no one who can move from the first position to the second. So I could, and I'm actually strongly tempted to, I could leave it right there. But then it's not in my nature to let off a captive audience so easily. When I debate with Jews and Muslims and Christians, I very often find, I say, well, do you really believe there was a virgin birth? Do you really believe in a Genesis creation? Do you really believe in bodily resurrection? And I get a sort of Monty Python reply. Well, there's a little bit of metaphorical, really. I'm not sure, and I'm going to find out, I'm determined to find out this evening, which line on this my antagonist does take, and I want you to notice, and I want you to test him on it. Because I think it's fair, and I'm going to talk to him and to you as if he did represent the Christian faith. I can't do all three monotheisms tonight. I may get a whack at the other two in the course of the discussion. I can only really do his. And I'm going to assume that it means something to him and that it's not just a humanist metaphysics. And I think I'm entitled to that assumption. The main thing I want to dispute this evening, because I'm either drowning in time with 20 minutes, it's either too much or too little, is this. You hear it very often said by people of a vague faith that, well, it may not be the case that religion is metaphysically true. Its figures and its stories may be legendary or dwell on the edge of myth, prehistoric. Its truth claims may be laughable. We have better explanations for the origins both of our cosmos and our species now, so much better so, in fact, that had they been available to begin with, religion would never have taken root. No one would now go back to the stage when we didn't have any real philosophy. We only had mythology. When we thought we lived on a flat planet, or when we thought that our planet was circulated by the sun instead of the other way around, when we didn't know there were microorganisms as part of creation and that they were more powerful than us and had dominion over us rather than we them, when we were fearful, the infancy of our species, we wouldn't have taken up theism if we'd known now what we did then. But allow for all that. Allow for all that. You still have to credit religion with being the source of ethics and morals. Where would we get these from if it weren't for faith? I think if, in the time I've got, I think that's the position I most want to undermine. I don't believe that it's true that religion is moral or ethical. I certainly don't believe, of course, that any of its explanations about the origin of our species or the cosmos or its ultimate destiny are true either. In fact, I think most of these have been conclusively, utterly discredited. But I'll deal with the remaining claim. Is it moral? Again, I can only do Christianity this evening. Is it moral to believe that your sins, yours and mine, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, can be forgiven by the punishment of another person? Is it ethical to believe that? I would submit that the doctrine of vicarious redemption by human sacrifice is utterly immoral. I might, if I wished, if I knew any of you, or you were my friends, or even if I didn't know you, but I just loved the idea of you. Compulsory love is another sickly element of Christianity, by the way. But suppose I could say, look, you're in debt. I've just made a lot of money out of a God-bashing book. I'll pay your debts for you. Maybe you'll pay me back someday, but for now I can get you out of trouble. I could say, if I really loved someone who'd been sentenced to prison, if I could find a way of saying I'd serve your sentence, I'd try and do it. I could do what Sidney Carton does in A Tale of Two Cities. If you like, I'm very unlikely to do this unless you've been incredibly sweet to me. I'll take your place on the scaffold, but I can't take away your responsibilities. I can't forgive what you did. I can't say you didn't do it. I can't make you washed clean. The name for that in primitive Middle Eastern society was scapegoating. You pile the sins of the tribe on a goat, you drive that goat into the desert to die of thirst and hunger, and you think you've taken away the sins of the tribe. A positively immoral doctrine that abolishes the concept of personal responsibility on which all ethics and all morality must depend. It has a further implication. I'm told that I have to have a share in this human sacrifice, even though it took place long before I was born. I had no say in it happening. I wasn't consulted about it. Had I been present, I would have been bound to do my best to stop the public torture and execution of an eccentric preacher. I would do the same even now. No, I'm implicated in it. I myself drove in the nails. I was present at Calvary. It confirms the original filthy sin in which I was conceived and born, the sin of Adam in Genesis. Again, this may sound a mad belief, but it is the Christian belief. Well, it's here that we find something very sinister about monotheism and about religious practice in general. It is incipiently, at least, and I think often explicitly, totalitarian. I have no say in this. I am born under a celestial dictatorship which I could not have had any hand in choosing. I don't put myself under its government. I am told that it can watch me while I sleep. I'm told that it can convict me of, here's the definition of totalitarianism, thought crime. For what I think, I may be convicted and condemned. And that if I commit a right action, it's only to evade this punishment. And if I commit a wrong action, I'm going to be caught up not just with punishment in life for what I've done, which often follows axiomatically, but even after I'm dead. In the Old Testament, gruesome as it is, recommending as it is of genocide, racism, tribalism, slavery, genital mutilation, the displacement and destruction of others, terrible as the Old Testament gods are, they don't promise to punish the dead. There's no talk of torturing you after the earth has closed over the Amalekites. Only till when gentle Jesus, meek and mild, makes his appearance, are those who won't accept the message told they must depart into everlasting fire. Is this morality? Is this ethics? I submit, not only is it not only does it come with the false promise of vicarious redemption, but it is the origin of the totalitarian principle which has been such a burden and shame to our species for so long. I further think that it undermines us in our most essential integrity. It dissolves our obligation to live and witness in truth. Which of us would say that we would believe something because it might cheer us up, or tell our children that something was true because it might dry their eyes? Which of us indulges in wishful thinking, who really cares about the pursuit of truth at all costs and at all hazards? Can it not be said, do you not in fact hear it said repeatedly about religion and by the religious themselves that, well, it may not be really true, the stories may be fairy tales, the history may be dubious, but it provides consolation? Can anyone hear themselves saying this or have it said of them without some kind of embarrassment, without the concession that thinking here is directly wishful? That yes, it would be nice if you could throw your sins and your responsibilities on someone else and have them dissolved, but it's not true, and it's not morally sound. And that's the second ground of my indictment. Michael, you will tell me when I'm trespassing on the time of Dr. McGrath, won't you? On our integrity, our basic integrity, in knowing right from wrong and being able to choose the right action over a wrong one, I think one must repudiate the claim that one doesn't have this moral discrimination innately, that no, it must come only from the agency of a celestial dictatorship, which one must love and simultaneously fear. What is it like? I've never tried it. I've never been a cleric. What is it like to lie to children for a living and tell them that they have an authority that they must love, compulsory love, what a grotesque idea, and be terrified of at the same time? What's that like, I want to know? And that we don't have an innate sense of right and wrong. The children don't have an innate sense of fairness and decency, which of course they do. What is it like? I can personalize it to this extent. My mother's Jewish ancestors are told that until they got to Sinai, they'd been dragging themselves around the desert under the impression that adultery, murder, theft, and perjury were all fine.
I get to Mount Sinai only to be told it's not kosher after all. I'm sorry. Excuse me. We must have more self-respect than that for ourselves and for others. Of course, the story is a fiction. It's a fabrication exposed conclusively by Israeli archaeology. Nothing of the sort ever took place, but suppose we take the metaphor. It's an insult. It's an insult to us. It's an insult to our deepest integrity. No, if we'd believed that perjury, murder, and theft were all right, we wouldn't have got as far as the foot of Mount Sinai or anywhere else. Now we're told what we have to believe. And this is coming now to the question of whether or not science, reason, and religion are compatible, or I would rather say reconcilable. The great Stephen Jay Gould, the late great Stephen Jay Gould, said that he believed they were non-overlapping magisteria. You can be both a believer and a person of faith. Sitting in front of me is a very distinguished, extremely distinguished scholar, Francis Collins, helped us to unlock the Human Genome Project, who is himself a believer. I'd love to hear from him. I hope we will hear from him. I don't believe he says that his discoveries in the genome convinced him of the truth of religion. He holds it, as it were, independently. I hope I do you no wrong, sir, in phrasing it like that. Here's why I, a non-scientist, will say that I think it's radically irreconcilable, I'd rather say, than incompatible. I've taken the best advice I can on how long Homo sapiens has been on the planet. Carl Sagan, Richard Dawkins, many others, and many discrepant views from theirs, reckon it's not more than 250,000 years, quarter of a million years. It's not less either. I think it's roughly accepted. I think, sir, you wouldn't disagree. 100,000 is the lowest I've heard. And actually, I was about to say, again, not to sound too Jewish, I'll take 100,000. I only need 100,000. Call it 100. For 100,000 years, Homo sapiens was born, usually, well, not usually, but very often, dying in the process or killing its mother in the process. Life expectancy, probably not much more than 20, 25 years. Dying probably of the teeth after that, very agonizingly, near to the brain as they are, or of hunger, or of microorganisms that they didn't know existed, or of events such as volcanic or tsunami or earthquake types that would have been wholly terrifying and mysterious, as well as some turf wars over women, land, property, food, other matters. You can fill in, imagine it for yourself, what the first few tens of thousands of years were like. And we like to think, learning a little bit in the process, and certainly having gods all the way, worshipping bears fairly early on, I can sort of see why. Sometimes worshipping other human beings, big mistake. I'm coming back to that if I have time. This and that and the other thing. But exponentially perhaps improving, though in some areas of the world very nearly completely dying out, and a bitter struggle all along. Call it 100,000 years. According to the Christian faith, heaven watches this with folded arms for 98,000 years, and then decides it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would be a human sacrifice in primitive Palestine, where the news would take so long to spread that it still hasn't penetrated very large parts of the world. And that would be our redemption of the human species. Now, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that is what I've just said, which you must believe to believe the Christian revelation, is not possible to believe, as well as not decent to believe. Why is it not possible? Because a virgin birth is more likely than that. A resurrection is more likely than that. And because if it was true, it would have two further implications. It would have to mean that the designer of this plan was unbelievably lazy and inept, or unbelievably callous and cruel and indifferent and capricious. And that is the case with every argument for design and every argument for revelation and intervention that has ever been made. But it's now conclusively so because of the superior knowledge that we've won for ourselves by an endless struggle to assert our reason, our science, our humanity, our extension of knowledge against the priests, against the rabbis, against the mullahs who've always wanted us to consider ourselves as made from dust or from a clot of blood, according to the Quran, or as the Jews are supposed to pray every morning, at least not female or Gentile. And here's my final point, because I think it's coming to it. The final insult that religion delivers to us, the final poison it jets into our system. It appeals both to our meanness, our self-centeredness, and our solipsism, and to our masochism. In other words, it's sadomasochistic. I'll put it like this. You're a clot of blood, you're a piece of mud, you're lucky to be alive. God fashioned you for his convenience, even though you're born in filth and sin. And even though every religion there's ever been is distinguished principally by the idea that we should be disgusted by our own. Name me a religion that does not play upon that fact. So you're lucky to be here, originally sinful and covered in shame and filth as you are. You're a wretched creature. But take heart. The universe is designed with you in mind. And heaven has a plan for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I close by saying, I can't believe there is a thinking person here who does not realize that our species would begin to grow to something like its full height if it left this childishness behind, if it emancipated itself from this sinister, childish nonsense. And I now commit you to the good Dr. McGrath. Thank you.
Plausible though it may seem, I want to talk about the 10 Commandments. Who am I, you may well ask, to instruct or advise you on these grave matters, but even Moses himself was a revisionist and issued at least 4 versions of the Decalogue, or the top 10. So if he can be a revisionist, well, so can I. Picture then, if you will, that I'm not just taking a blue pencil, but an actual chisel, and seeing if these tablets of stone could possibly stand a bit of an update for our time. Numbers 1 and 2 actually don't have anything to do with ethics at all. They are injunctions. They remind or instruct you that I am the Lord thy God, that thou shalt have no other gods before me, and they forbid the making of graven images. The commandment against the making of graven images, or images of God, is very upsetting to many Catholics who often leave this bit of the commandment out, because where would Christian art and devotional painting be if you couldn't make impressive images of God, his son, his son's mother? Then we are rather sternly ordered not to take the name of this God in vain, and it's then added rather superfluously that you won't be held guiltless if you do take the name of this Lord in vain. Well, no one has ever worked out exactly how to obey this commandment. Is it taking the Lord's name in vain to shout, God is great, while blowing yourself up and killing innocent people? Some say it's obedience to the law of God. When I say God knows, I really mean I think that nobody knows. It's usually wise when promulgating eternal laws to be clear about what you mean. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The Christians who want this inscribed in courtrooms and in schoolrooms would end up taking Saturday off rather than Sunday, because this program of commandments is actually a program for the establishment of a fundamentalist Jewish state. Commandment number 5 enjoins that thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, which seems reasonable enough. It's an interesting commandment because when given in full, it says that if you do so, you will have a longer tenure of the land that's been promised to you. It's one of the few commandments that comes with an inducement, if you will. It even seems to suggest that you should honor your father and mother because you expect a legacy from them. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Almost immediately after the events at Sinai and the delivery of these instructions by God from the top of the mountain, Moses orders all his supporters to draw their swords and kill all their friends and brothers for their profanity. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. The Turkish government, an Islamic party, recently tried to make this actual law in Turkey itself, but failed. It's difficult to see why this well-known offense should be classified with murder and theft and perjury. Usually the punishment for those who commit it is what you might call self-inflicted. Commandment number 8, thou shalt not steal. Very little to quarrel with here. We don't know of any society that has a commandment saying it's okay to steal, or a social custom that allows it. Then we arrive at a moment of comparatively rare nuance and sophistication. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. The idea of convicting someone who is innocent by bearing false testimony against them is and should be shocking to the entire human conscience. So this is not only one of the finest of the commandments, maybe the finest, but in its stress on the not and the false witness against, it shows a very rare and careful sense of the balance and scruple that's required for judgment and justice. The last of, at least this version of the Ten Commandments, is also sometimes famous by its number, number 10. It forbids the coveting of your neighbor's or thy neighbor's goods, these to include his ox, his ass, his wife. I think there may be 3 thinkable objections here. First, and most obvious, it considers the female of the human species to be equivalent to the chattel. Second, by way of objection, it's the only commandment that punishes thought. Here you're not forbidden to do anything. You're forbidden to think even about something. And third, the attempt to suppress an instinct, a desire that must have been put by God into us in the first place. Otherwise, how would we know? The essential division of opinion is this: did God make men, or did men make many gods? There are enough discrepancies just in the well-known version for us to be certain that we're looking here at a God who improvises, who's jealous, who's short of temper, who's inconsistent, or, if by any chance God didn't make Moses and the Hebrews, that the people who made God were jealous, short-tempered, inconsistent, and capricious in their turn. How might a Decalogue look if it was written for the 21st century? I never quite trust myself beginning a sentence by saying, "Thou shalt not," but let's see if we can adapt this famous question. Number 1, do not condemn people on the basis of their ethnicity or their color. Number 2, do not ever even think of using people as private property, or as owned or as slaves. 3, despise those who use violence or the threat of it in sexual relations. Number 4, hide your face and weep if you dare to harm a child. Number 5, do not condemn people for their inborn nature. Why would God create so many homosexuals only in order to torture and destroy them? Number 6, be aware that you too are an animal and dependent on the web of nature. Try and think and act accordingly. Number 7, don't imagine that you can escape judgment if you rob people with a false prospectus rather than with a knife. Number 8, turn off that f***ing cell phone. You can have no idea how unimportant your call is to us. Number 9, denounce all jihadists and crusaders for what they are: psychopathic criminals with ugly delusions and terrible sexual repressions. Number 10, be willing to renounce any God or any faith if any holy commandments should contradict any of the above. In short, don't swallow your moral code in tablet form.
As I pointed out in a previous video, there are really only a handful of people that I wish I had had the chance to listen to before they passed away, including but not limited to George Carlin, Tupac, Carl Sagan, and Christopher Hitchens. Sure, most of these guys, I actually think all of these guys passed away after I was born, but they did all pass away before I was either old enough to understand things they stood for or just before I was introduced to their content altogether. Yeah, now actually another thing that kept popping into my mind while listening to Hitchens is just how different his delivery is compared to that of his peers like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, Brian Cox, and the likes. When you take Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, and Brian Cox, for instance, they have an almost disinterested approach to their critique of religion. Like almost, they do not care about religious people and their beliefs whatsoever. They are just here to do what they're equipped to do and will only engage in religious talks when they're asked to. And even then, you will get a sense that they just don't really care about the absurdity of it all. Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, on the other hand, man, they are always invested in whatever debate they are part of, and you can always tell that they have this deep-seated detestation and vitriol for religion and all those who have partaken in dispensing these lies to the masses, and most importantly, as Richard Dawkins always says, to children. Basically, those who are feeding this delusion pipeline that, anyway, my point is, I'm not saying either of the two is better. I just believe each leaves you feeling different, like the true styles of presentation. Hitchens and Dawkins make you feel energized and ready for this intellectual battle in an effort to eradicate dogmatism. With the likes of Neil, however, they just leave you calmly assured that this delusion must come to an end. Just leave religious people to their own devices, provided they do not attempt to influence science, schools, politics, or the likes. Basically, the fact that they preach the logical inconsistencies within their doctrines are certainly becoming the undoing in real time. I mean, even take a look at the religious right. In their bid to completely ban something like abortion because their faith forbids it, they are forced to go through these weird mental gymnastics to logically justify it, man. Well, no, it's not life over personal rights, because we see how tense they get when anyone mentions gun reforms to protect the actual lives of kids and the tens of thousands of people every year who die from gun violence. For some reason, in those cases, they think individual rights should triumph or else. Yeah. Anyway, that's not the only thing I've always loved about Christopher Hitchens, man, and what he stood for. Because even in his last days, actually, I recently learned he unapologetically stood for whatever he believed in and wasn't willing to compromise for anything, man. I have actually an example. As most of you guys who have read about his life already know, Christopher Hitchens was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus in 2010. And he actually at one point would say that after he got sick, there was a whole movement of people claiming to pray for him. The movement at one point was even named an Everyday Pray for Hitchens Day. Now, when asked how he felt about it all, he'd say that while on one hand, some of those in these movements genuinely were interested in his quick recovery and simply wished that he'd get better, he'd also point out that a disturbing majority in this Everyday Pray for Hitchens Day movement had professed a wish that he, Christopher Hitchens, would reconcile himself with the supernatural or divine, something that Hitchens himself would call a large counterfeit. Actually, I have a direct quote of what Christopher Hitchens said. I wrote back to some of the people, some of them in holy orders who are running registered organization, and asked, when you say, "Oh, pray for me," do you mind if I ask what for? A lot of these people would reply, according to Hitchens, not really for your recovery, but so that you can see the error of your ways. Does that response surprise any of us, really? I don't think so, not me at least. Now, in Christopher Hitchens' pure fashion, here is what he had to say about these kinds of people and religious leaders. Now, I find this not as easy to be graceful about, because though it's put in a nice way, it's part of a phenomenon that I've always thought of as very disgusting, which is the belief of the religious, which they keep expressing, that surely now that you're dying, your fears will overcome your reason. I hope I do not have to underline what's horrible about that. There is an element of blackmail to it and an element of tremendous security on their part. I mean, they don't seem to feel they're doing the argument so easily with someone who's mentally and physically strong. By the way, I think they're right. You've just got to love this guy, man. Unfortunately, he would pass away at the age of 62 in December 15, 2011. The cause of death, of course, was ruled to be pneumonia and complication of his esophageal cancers. And for those who know nothing about the interesting life of Christopher Hitchens, I find it interesting. Here is a brief rundown. Christopher Hitchens was an English-born American author, journalist, and literary critic. In his life, he was a contributor to Free Inquiry, Vanity Fair, Slate, The Nation, World Affairs, The Atlantic, and a variety of other media outlets. Christopher Hitchens was also a renowned political observer whose best-selling books made him a staple of talk shows, and to this day, easily one of his most famous books is God Is Not Great, which, if you haven't read, man, trust me, you're missing out. And if you'd like to, I'll try to find it and leave a link to it in the description section below. Hopefully I remember. Anyway, throughout his life, Hitchens was also an intellectual and polemicist. I'll be honest, actually, when I first came across the word polemicist, I did not know what it meant, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. It apparently means a person who engages in controversial debates. Yeah, you learn something new every day, man. So, now, on to something that Hitchens and I disagreed vehemently. Even though Hitchens was mostly identified with the Anglo-American radical political left, near the end of his life, he would embrace one of, in my opinion, the most shelfful right-wing cause, which is the Iraqi invasion. Following the September attacks in America, he enthusiastically, which is actually the word that's been used in most publications, he enthusiastically supported an interventionist foreign policy, and today we'll know what that culminated into in the Middle East and the number of lives that have been wasted thus far directly thanks to the invasion. I honestly tend to have limited grace when it comes to people who either supported or actively participated in that atrocity, man. But at the same time, I also often wonder if I have the advantage of hindsight. Perhaps I luckily wasn't told enough to form an opinion about the whole thing at the time. Yeah, so perhaps maybe that's it. But if you think today still that shit was justified, man, yeah, can't really say anything about you. Oh, and actually, needless to say, Christopher Hitchens was a devout anti-theist, and he would describe himself as a firm believer in the Enlightenment values of secularism, reason, and humanism. Yeah, so that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for sticking with me to the end and taking the time out of your busy schedule. As always say, I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I did curating it. I also hope you've liked the video and left a comment sharing your thoughts so the video can reach even more people. Otherwise, rest in eternal peace, Christopher Hitchens, and I hope you all stay safe out there. Peace, man.